Good evening. I'd like to call to order the February 27th, 2024 work session. And I'd like to announce that meetings of the Mechanicsburg Area School District Board of Directors are being recorded and live streamed for the purpose of transparency and increased public access. The live stream, along with the recordings from previously held meetings, can be found on the school board's YouTube channel. Move on to item 3. Budget and Finance, item 3.01, request for proposal, insurance broker, Mr. Longwell.
Thank you, Mr. Up. So this is some good news. I'm pleased to report to the board the results of a request for proposal that we had offered to some brokerages to basically serve as the district's insurance broker. And so for a long time we've used Willis Towers, and periodically we will either benchmark our professional services against kind of where we are with our colleagues to find, making sure we're getting good value, but also from time to time we'll also just do a request for proposal. And so this is exempt from bidding because it is a professional service. The request for a proposal, the way we determine who receives it is that we often poll our colleagues to see who are professional services that they might use. What we found was there were three firms that were recommended and used most frequently. We had submitted a request for proposal. One of them declined to submit a proposal, and the other two did. Gallagher is not our incumbent. Willis Towers was. Gallagher, over a 3-year period, you can see, has submitted a proposal at $105,000 versus the incumbent at $156,000. So that's a net savings of $51,000 over 3 years. We have separately vetted both carriers, but especially with Gallagher being the low, to know that they've received good references from our colleagues, especially those in our IU, that Gallagher comes highly recommended. We've interviewed them, and so our recommendation to the board is to move forward with Gallagher for insurance brokerage services. So,
since that's not an official bid, do you have the luxury of going to Willis Towers and saying, can you match this?
Yeah, I think we certainly have some flexibility to talk to both of them. I think Willis Towers, for a long time, and this is something Dr. Light and I have talked about, the underwriters, the big insurance houses, they often establish a percentage that they pay brokers. And so Willis Towers has just basically stood pat on that's the percentage they're paid because that's what the insurance is saying. I think Gallagher is probably reducing that, is my guess. I think the other thing is, from a customer service standpoint, I think it's probably time, it's a good time for a change. Yeah. I think Gallagher is going to provide exceptional level of customer service, in-person visits. I think the things that we would want, especially at the cost that you see. So that's our recommendation. Good question.
Sean Webb does such a nice job of saying it so nicely. I will say that cost was not the only reason that we went out for an RFP.
I got that from him.
That would be something if needed, we could continue it.
But I was curious when you said it wasn't a bid, if that was an option.
Yep.
And it sounds like you have good references for them too.
Yes. Yes. In fact, they represent, I don't want to say a third of the districts in our IU, but it's a significant number of them.
Yeah.
So
great. So would this be a 3-year contract that we're looking to
yes, sir.
with them?
Yep. Yep.
If they keep the same rate, maybe we could get a 5 or 10-year contract.
Yeah. Keep that going.
Any other questions? All right, then we'll move that forward for March's meeting for the vote. And we'll move on to item 4, curriculum. Item 4.01, school calendar 2024-2025. Dr. Lyon.
Just think about that, 2024, 2025, where does time go? This is a process that we go through on an annual basis, and just some background information for everybody. We typically start this conversation in November timeframe. We have an initial look at the calendar, just what does this look like moving forward. This was one of those years where if you pushed it, you could get 2 weeks at the holidays, at winter break. And so based on my experience of being able to do that a couple times in my career, I will be honest and say I pushed for that. It's almost like a reset, if you will, for everybody. And so that was part of this that was a little bit unique this year. That said, we run several drafts of this, and one of the groups that we run this through is our professional development committee that is in the district, obviously with administrator and teacher representatives on that. The other group that is really important that we work with on this is our CTC, the school districts that feed to the CTC. I don't envy them at all for trying to work with 13 different school districts and getting calendars aligned. One of the challenges they have, obviously, is when do they start school compared to everybody else. And so we do try to work with them and collaborate with them as much as we can on what the calendar looks like. And then, obviously, we bring it back again through our administrative team for a final look. So a lot of set of eyes, lots of sets of eyes go on to this calendar. Very quickly, I'll run through this specific calendar for you to share that our staff would come back on the 19th. Our students would start on the 26th. And just a reminder, we do a staggered start for our K-3 students, which we've done now for several years and we think is really a good way of handling that for our youngest students. We have the 4-day Labor Day recess, and then pretty solid through September. In October, you'll notice that there are Act 80 days in addition to a fall recess. And those Act 80 days, over the years, you will notice that the Act 80 days have actually lessened from where they were 2 years ago, but they're significantly more than they were 5 years ago, if you will. And I think that specific to the Act 80, that really was some lessons that we learned through COVID of the value of having opportunity to work with staff. As you go into November, you'll see that we also have professional development days that are part of the contract, and the typical recess at Thanksgiving, along with Monday to shop, and then the long extended holiday break. So give us a Monday to shop. All right. And then again, a couple Act 80 days in January. You'll see them again in February, typically about one a month through the spring, if you will. It appears that spring recess is going to occur almost 2 full weeks later next year than it is this year. And so that, frankly, is a good break for everybody in the month of April. And then we have our May, one more day there in May for Act 80, and then wrap up on the 6th. We did just a couple things. We did build in a traditional snow day this year, just like we did this current year, and then looking at remote learning days after the makeup day for the first one moving forward. What that does is allow us to, and families to know that we're going to be done on June 6th. It's not going to carry over into the next week, which we often hear from families is one thing that they appreciate from it. I've learned over the years that you will never make 100% of the people happy with the calendar, and don't even try. So we go through this process and try to focus obviously first on students, staff, and then families as best we can. The one thing that you may have heard about recently is the legislative change around school calendars. It's amazing what a single word can do when you talk about legislation. And so previously the legislation was written at both the number of days and the number of hours that were required in a school calendar. Just within the last 2 months maybe, the legislation was changed and the word changed from and to or. And so now a school district can decide, are you going to go after the number of days or the number of hours? I would argue that we've really pretty much gone towards the number of hours historically because of our use of Act 80 days anyway. And so with this calendar, I can tell the board that we are meeting the number of instructional hours that were required to meet, and this calendar satisfies that. So there you go. Questions, Jan?
In regard to that legislation, I mean, is there anything to stop schools from having 2-hour days? Like,
So it's so interesting you asked that. You get a group of superintendents together and the questions that can come out of that, and that was one of the questions. And so I think what's happening, frankly, is like with most legislation, it gets passed and then PD has to interpret, okay, now what does this mean? And so we've asked questions like, well, why do you even need Act 80 days anymore? Like that, this legislation seems to remove that. You're either doing 900 and 990 hours or you're doing 180 days. Why do we even call them Act 80? Well, they're not ready to answer that yet. All right, and that's okay. Believe me, I understand how things have to work through a process. What is a day? If you go with days,
Right.
What's a day? Does it have to be a certain amount of time? If you've chosen, we're going to not worry about hours, we're going to do 180 days, but we only bring kids in for 2 hours a day. And so here's what's interesting about this, and I'm get on my soapbox a little bit. I cannot remember in my lifetime legislation that's been has gone unanimous from committee on both sides of the aisle all the way through the vote is being unanimous. And I just find it fascinating that our legislature that, can't agree on a whole lot of things, agreed to this. So I don't know if it was depth of understanding about what just simply changing one word meant or what the case was, but it was unanimous through the legislature.
So you're not aware of really what started why it was started? I mean,
Yeah, I think.
what's the intent, I guess?
I think part of what started it was COVID, honestly. And I think districts were trying to figure things out. And we saw the value here of Act 80 time. And at the time, I had a few conversations myself with PDE about help us figure out what this really means. Why is it all of a sudden okay that we can do days or hours, right? And I just think it opened people's eyes to what opportunities might exist, and maybe one of the fringe benefits of.
So it's really to give more it appears to be to give more flexibility to each district.
There's no
on how
question
they
about
want to manage their resources.
But I also think that if not careful, districts, you don't want to abuse it either, right?
Right.
So there was a reason that it was unanimously passed. So what's the underlying reason that it was unanimously
Did
passed?
it give any regulatory authority to PDE to make additional rules in it to enforce it, or was it just?
Well, they always have the regulatory authority. I think there's some questions now about what defines a day. What now does this mean for Act 80 as two examples?
So it just defers to them to come up with the.
That's my understanding.
I have a question about the remote learning days,
Mhm.
the value that we see in those at all.
Yeah.
Is there any?
Yeah, so I think it's one of the
Okay.
conversations that we've had here too about that. And it is, interestingly, one of our principals had just put out to the parents of our primary students, which frankly is the group that I'm most concerned about with remote days, especially based on our pandemic experience in remote time. And the feedback was very positive for the first remote day, which I was surprised by, I'll be honest with you. I would say I think what I saw, I don't know if you had a chance to see it or not, but I think there were 18 respondents to it, and 17 of them were very positive about it. As an educator, I worry about it very much, and I think that we've got to be careful. I also worry about what the school look like on June 9th, 10th, and 11th too. And so that's the other challenge with this and the give and take. Maybe we just cancel winter and we won't have to worry about it.
I
But
think we used to embed more snow days. That's how we
we
used
used
to
to
do it.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and so now we
There
have
are
one.
options.
Yeah.
As opposed to having, I don't even know what happens on a remote learning day. So it's hard for me to be comfortable with that as an
Yeah.
idea even.
Yeah, you could go back to embedding another snow day within the calendar, but I can't remember ever having more than 2 days built into the calendar before we started adding on to the end of the year.
I'd be interested, since we had the first day like this in non-pandemic time, like, and there were attendance requirements that were based on, did you sign into the Zoom, or did you do this work within this time period? What was that? What did the attendance look like at the high school and at the primaries too? But I think I was thinking about this because Steph and I were talking about this earlier, so it got me thinking. But I didn't send this in earlier, so I was thinking about it though. The idea that my neighborhood, 2/3 of the neighborhood had a power outage that day, and not of the parents who were their parents working at home, their kids working at home, all trying to like feed off someone's hotspot. So not I think they managed, and yet you could just as easily have blown off the day in a sense. And I wouldn't have. A bunch of people had to go go stay at hotels at night because there wasn't any power still out, right? So it's maybe an extreme example, but I also think of it from the lens of people who that might be a dedicated group, the folks I'm friends with on Facebook who said, "Oh, my power's out, my kids are still working." So not an accurate sample, but an idea of that's a group that was trying. What about the other group that had other reasons that couldn't make it work? So I don't know what the data might show out of that.
Yeah.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah, our principals actually reported that the attendance figures for that day were as good, if not better, than most typical days in the surrounding weeks. And in the case of middle school and high school, that meant students that were attending their Zooms, and then the Zooms for the most part in those situations were 10 or 15 minutes long, and then even more after that. In the case of K through 5, it was students who had completed their packet and turned in their packet. At 4 or 5, if they completed one of their 2 teachers' packets, they would get a half day if they completed both together. But all in all, the principals reported that it was very good.
It's good to hear.
My concern though, from a packet standpoint, it's not the same as a day with a teacher.
Oh, there's no question.
Right.
There is
It's
no
not
way,
the
and we
same.
learned that in COVID, there's no way that we can replace education. I'm happy about that because we just invested a lot of money in
That's right.
schools.
That's right.
And COVID proved that was a good investment because we need kids here, we know that. I think the question is, what's the alternative? And, it's the age-old issue. You're going into the second week of June. What are you benefiting from there too? And so it is that challenge. And that's why last year we landed on the 1-on-1. Let's see what this looks like.
Well, or do some of the Act 80 days go into that time frame versus the other days?
Well, but that's a challenge too, from a
I
professional development
understand.
standpoint,
I
because now
understand.
all of a sudden you're saying professional development isn't all that important. We're gonna let
Oh,
that
no.
go
Well,
off.
some people prefer
to another
professional
time.
development at that time also. Having it after the school year, right after.
Depends on what it is.
That is true. I don't disagree. You've been there. I know. I
Yep.
agree.
I will say I was really happy that the packets were prepped and we had a false start on one, right? The weather looked like it, so packet came home, it was great, and we didn't need to use it. Then the next time was a different packet too, so it wasn't just there was a lot of preparation that went into it. So I applaud everybody for planning it out to the extent you could.
And I am not a huge fan of it drives me nuts to think that we're doing packets, but that frankly was the feedback from COVID that we heard, that don't try to get these 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds online who may be staying with grandma, who doesn't know how to do that, or somebody else, or they have to work at the same time. And so as much as I dislike packets, it was really a result of what we learned from the remote work that pushed us for our youngest
They're the
kids.
best, I think.
For our youngest kids.
And the kindergartners have packets also?
I believe so, yeah, it's K through 3,
K5.
K5.
In our experience, we had electricity. It worked very well. It seemed like the response from the school was very well organized. And again, not having to stay all day on Zoom worked very well. I do have a question though about the snow day, the official snow day. Is there a specific determining factor on what that day will be? Because is it the first day and then it rains, or is there do you get to pick which one of the snow days is?
No, it's actually on here, that
Okay.
April 17th is and yeah, that, I hear what you're saying. We've always said we're gonna go in order, because believe you me, I'd love the flexibility to say, all right, after day 3, now we're gonna start adding on to the end, but you wanna see people's heads explode, you start changing the calendar in that way. That's not good. But I do believe that that's something the board's gonna have to wrestle with at some point, the administration's gonna have to wrestle with. We've been really fortunate the last several winters. I think last year we didn't have any, right?
Correct.
And so this year so far too.
We have a hurricane.
You have a, maybe, yeah.
We had one,
Yeah.
one
Like
year
September.
recently that we had the hurricane and at the second or third day of school.
Yeah.
That was our snow day.
But you have a year where you have 5 or 6, and I think, to your point, do you work in that we would do X number of remote days, but after that, we would need to reconsider what we would do, and that's.
Oh, I just wanted to make sure there was snow when the kids had all.
Yeah.
So if you can talk to the big guy.
Yeah.
All right, any other discussion?
That other topic that we brought up, which kind of blends into that, we want to leave it for another time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions on the calendar? We'll move that forward for next month for further discussion and a vote. Move on to item 7, policy. I'm just going to go ahead and read all 3 into the record and then turn it over. 7.01, first reading of revised board policy 127, assessment of educational program. 7.02, first reading of revised board policy 216.1, supplemental discipline records. And 7.03, first reading of new board policy 254, educational opportunity for military children. Dr. Leidy.
Yes, sir, and actually, I'm just going to pass it on to Mr. Bitts.
Sure. First policy, policy 127, is a really basic change. Basically, the state has changed the viewing window that parents have the opportunity to ask to review state assessments. They do this periodically. With the change, it made us look back at the policy to make sure that we were aligned, and we needed to change some language there. This time around, we changed it simply to that we're going to follow whatever the state tells us to follow. So we don't have to continue to go back in and change it, but we'll just follow whatever the timeline they might change it to. The second policy, 216.1, supplemental discipline records, this comes as a result of some legislation change and comes from PSBA's recommendation. We already had policy 216.1, so you see in the track changes some pretty significant changes. In terms of highlights of those changes, essentially what the policy does is it dictates what kind of information needs to be shared back and forth when a student is adjudicated. And for the most part, many of the law changes are actually what others have to share with us as a school district when that should happen. There are some other pieces that changed in there, and probably one of the most exciting pieces, if you will, is that PSBA included some pretty specific timelines in terms of information sharing between districts when a student transfers in and out of the district. I'm happy to say that the timelines that PSBA put in there are consistent with what practices we already have in place. But hopefully the consistency across the state will allow other districts to have those same kinds of timelines when we're getting information as well. The one other piece that I'll point out to you in this policy is the last section, which was entitled Reciprocity of Discipline. This was something that through this policy review we came to find out was a section that we have had in place for quite some time, but is not something that PSBA had been recommending. So it appears to be a section that we had added, which it isn't completely unusual, but as we were reviewing it, the solicitor did share with us that that section, the language there, would not be something that they would be able to defend and ultimately wouldn't stand up. Basically, it was talking about if a student was coming to us with an expulsion, that we would basically automatically be honoring that expulsion or what the discipline was that was coming to us. the law says that that reciprocity has to happen and can happen with a weapons violation. And we already have that reciprocity built into policy 218.1, which is our weapons policy. But we can't extend that automatic expulsion to other consequences as well. But what we were able to do was, quite frankly, get us into an even better place, I think. We added a line within transfer into the district that shows upon receipt, a student's disciplinary record will undergo an administrative review, which may result in the placement of the student in an alternative assignment. And quite frankly, that statement better reflects our processes to date anyway, and captures issues that go beyond expulsion as well. And obviously with it being an administrative review and may result, that's something that ultimately a family could appeal to the board in those kinds of situations too. So even though we were a little hesitant and concerned when we got that first feedback, I think we're actually in a better place with the language that we have. Any questions on those two, and then I know Mr. Bigham's going to.
So if I heard you correctly, someone comes into our district from another district and they've been expelled from that school and that district, the parents can still request almost like another hearing with the new district to appeal continuing on that expulsion?
So it would somewhat depend on what stage of the process they were in that situation in the other district, and we would have to walk through that with the solicitor to know for sure where one process begins and one ends. Oftentimes, and I think what you see is a student, as soon as the outcome or as soon as the issue happens, even before the process gets started, they look to transfer into a different district. But ultimately, it's something that we would, with this language, be able to review either way and then act accordingly.
Okay, thank you.
Questions on those first two policies? Seeing that? Right.
All right, thank you. So policy 254 is educational opportunity for military children is a new policy. It is a mandated policy now through PSBA for us to have. However, the practice of making sure that we are not putting students of active duty or uniformed service students in a negative light when they transfer to the district has long been a district practice of support. Previously to this policy, there was a compact that existed between multiple states with regard to how school districts would not disadvantage students of military families because of their automatic or last minute type of movement or placement from district to district. An example of that would be in gifted education. The gifted is not federally defined for identification, it's state defined. So a student that moves from an out of state into Pennsylvania would have to meet Pennsylvania criteria through evaluation in order to receive gifted services. That could be anywhere from a 60-day to a 90-day period of evaluation, and that would put a student of a military family without services for 90 days. So therefore, as a result of that compact, we would not withhold gifted services for that student. We would provide them those provision of services under the conditions of their previous state. That would be different than what Pennsylvania said we would need to do. Another example would be graduation requirements, how we would adapt and how we would adjust to meet the needs of a student that would transfer to us that may have been in a different setting or a different system prior to us having a block schedule at our high school, and how those credits may put that child at a disadvantage. So basically, policy 254 formalizes that for us and basically allows the district to provide flexibility for students of military and uniformed service families, or active duty military and uniformed service families, with those exceptions to policy that would put the children at a disadvantage. So that's the tenets of policy 254.
Thank you, sir. Any questions about that policy?
And so this is a brand new policy?
It is a new policy, yes.
Because I was talking with the lady from Carlisle, and she was saying they have 400 to 500 students that they deal with in a given year,
Mhm.
dealing under this military, the transfer in, transfer out situation. And I knew we probably had some with the base, but nothing compared to the 400 to 500.
And prior to this policy, as I stated earlier, we would utilize that compact, which is referenced within the policy and linked to the policy. So if you want to see that compact, it will show you the provisions that we have been operating under for years. But this just formalizes it as a policy instead of a compact.
And for the scenario you said of a gifted student, we would still have the opportunity to do a quick evaluation to determine if there's a match on the services that they were getting in their district to what we could provide here.
Under the policy, we wouldn't even need to do that.
We would do.
We would provide them the provision of services as we would parallel to what we had done previously with the compact.
As long as we have the
Absolutely,
services.
absolutely, yes, with the information.
Great, thank you.
Questions? All right, then we'll move these three forward for the March 12th meeting for a second reading, discussion, and vote. Thank you, Mr. Baker.
Thank you.
That time, the meeting is adjourned, and we will meet in a few minutes in the room for an executive session. Personnel matter.